Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us here at Z Freedom Brew for our economic briefing. I am Jamie Sumner, the Chief Analyst, and for this briefing, we want to review over the Fed statement from yesterday, May 1st, and also look at the GDP release for the first quarter of 2019. So right now, you look at the Fed statement, and they continue to say similar things in terms of the labor market and the economic activity. They continue to say that the labor market remains strong and that the economic activity rose at a solid rate, which in fact was the case. We saw that GDP number come out at 3.2%, much higher than anticipated, but we're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. But overall, they do comment here that the growth of household spending and business fixed investments slowed in the first quarter. And we've seen that occur. We've reported on that retail sales number being a little light in the first 2 months of the year and then picked up in March. But on balance, you can see that they still see that the inflation measures have remained low in recent months, and we continue to see that inflation where it is. And the community, the committee decided to keep the target rate the same. It's been unchanged here, and they continue to see that the economic activity and the strong labor market conditions and inflation should be near their objectives going forward, and they will be patient. That patient word is still in their language, and as we said before, this patient is almost like an indicator. When we see that move away, that could be an indication that at the next meeting they may remove that rate. But overall, they continue to say the economic activity is on pace. When we look at the GDP, as I said, it came in at a 3.2%, stronger than anticipated. When we look at the individual components of that GDP, we see the consumer segment generating 82 basis points of the growth. That is much lower than we saw last quarter when it was at 166. So we saw this slowdown in that consumer segment. In fact, when we look at the goods spending, that actually decreased by 0.7% quarter over quarter. So we saw a reduction in spending on goods. However, we did see an offset with that 2% growth in services spending. But overall, we see this softening in that consumer side. Now, that's an important point because if you recall, this segment makes up about 70% of total GDP. Now with that, we look at the investments, that coming in at 92 basis points, higher than where we were last quarter at 66 basis points. And some of this is that business fixed investments increasing, which was a positive, but also a fair share of that growth is attributable to the inventory replenishment. So we saw inventories pick up a little bit and contributing a lot of that 92 basis points. We continue to see that residential fixed investment continue to be negative, so coming down. When we look at the next two, this is where the strength occurred. We saw the government at 41 basis points compared to where it was last quarter at -7 basis points. So we saw the government really start spending in that first quarter, and that for the most part was all state spending. In fact, state spending went up 3.9% while the federal spending number was flat, so it did not change. And then we look at the exports, imports, and we can see that contributed 103 basis points because we saw those exports increase and imports decline, which provided that large push in that net exports imports number. Whereas last quarter, we can see that was at -8 basis points. So a huge swing in there. Moving from here, we look at the overall inflation numbers in this report, and we see the personal consumption expenditures actually went up just 6.6% compared to last quarter at 1.5. In fact, if we look back, we go back to the fourth quarter of 2017, we saw that number top out at 2.7, and then throughout 2018, it consistently moved down and now hitting that low of just 0.6%. When we look at the core PCE number, that came in at 1.3%, lower than anticipated. In fact, last quarter it was at 1.8, so we saw that softening of that core inflation number. So that inflation isn't an issue, and that's one of the contributing factors to why we see that 10-year Treasury remaining where it is around that 2.5% range. Overall, when we look at the inflation expectations, we saw a little bit of a pickup throughout the first quarter of this year. And in April, though, we saw that come down just a little bit. So we still see this modest expectation of inflations. This is even going out 5 years. So that kind of contributes to the long end of the curve staying subdued in here. And now we look at the short end of the curve with the Fed fund probabilities. And as you can see, it looks like the projection is that going out to January of 2020, that there is a 62.5% chance of a rate cut. In fact, we look even in September of 2019, there's a 36.1% chance of a rate cut. So we look at that short end of the curve potentially coming down over the next year. Now, this is common when we look at the rates over history, and we see that whenever we get into this flat yield curve environment, the short end of the yield curve typically comes down much faster than the long end in the preceding years. So with that, we have that as an expectation over the next 12 months is that potential of the Fed to cut rates throughout the end of this year and potentially in the beginning of next year. That's what we have for you today. We hope you join us again here at Seaford and Brew for our economic briefing. Have a great day, everyone.